Hello, welcome to this presentation on ecopsychotherapy. My name is Beth Livingston. I have a psychotherapy and ecopsychotherapy practice based in Wellington. I'm in the 6th year of my training as an integrative psychotherapist at Bath Centre for Psychotherapy and Counselling. Part of my training has focused on ecopsychotherapy. Consequently, I've started working outdoors with some of my clients. I'm aware that in the current circumstances with COVID, other psychotherapists and counsellors might be considering working outdoors as a way of accommodating some of the social distancing requirements that we all have to now consider. So I thought there might be some value in me sharing some of my experiences as I start to work outdoors. I'm going to talk about some of the differences between working indoors and outdoors. I want to share with you some of the benefits that I found in working this way, as well as talking about some of the challenges. And there'll be a section on the theory which underpins the work I do as an ecopsychotherapist. The next section of the presentation will take the form of a slideshow. Ecopsychotherapy, taking client work outdoors. I think it might be useful to start with a definition of ecopsychotherapy. And the one I'm going to use is from Mary Jane Rust, who you might recall gave a talk to TAP a couple of years ago on ecopsychotherapy. She says, ecopsychotherapy is a relatively new form of psychotherapy, which understands that human relationships exist within the larger context of life on Earth. Psychotherapy invites us to tell the story of our human relationships. Ecopsychotherapy expands this to include our Earth story, the context or continuum in which our human relationships sit. So ecopsychotherapy then broadens psychotherapy and includes the context of our Earth story. And this means that our relationships with the Earth, the land, animals and plants are all included in the therapy, sometimes in the content of the session and sometimes in the process, as I think will become clearer through this talk. So if we think about working indoors or working outdoors, psychotherapy and counselling predominantly happen indoors, although of course you could take the same work and hold a session outside. Ecopsychotherapy, on the other hand, predominantly happens outdoors, but that's not to say that the themes of ecopsychotherapy might not also be included in a session indoors. If we're going to move outdoors, it seems to me that one of the things we need to give consideration to is what happens to the therapeutic frame. So from the start of my training, I was taught that therapy happened in particular circumstances that we refer to as the therapeutic frame. So those circumstances might include a contained space, a consistent room, which was quiet and confidential, where we were facing each other, that the session was time boundaried with minimal distractions and safety, and all of that would be managed by the therapist. I imagine that most of you will recognise at least some, if not all, of those conditions that are most conducive to therapy. But what happens then if we move outdoors? It's no longer a contained space. You look at that particular scenery there, there's no particular boundary to the space. It's often very open. It's not necessarily consistent. We might start at the same point each week, but we might wander off in very different directions. It's not always quiet. There might be traffic noise, other voices, running water, farm machinery. Is it still confidential if we're in a public place where we're seen by other people? We're not always facing each other. More often we're walking alongside each other. It's hard to be time bounded outside. There are always distractions of some sort, perhaps A deer wanders into the field, or a group of rooks starts squawking loudly. So there's always distractions. It's not as safe as working in an office, and it's certainly not all managed by me. There's an awful lot outside that is beyond my control. And yet my instinct is that nature heals, and that something quite magical can happen when we combine psychotherapy with contact with nature. And when I started exploring this way of working, it really felt to me as if I'd found the missing piece of the psychotherapy jigsaw, or that I'd found an extra dimension that brought so much about psychotherapy alive. So I'd like to talk now for a while about the benefits of ecopsychotherapy. First of all, nature joins in. The dyad of the therapist and client actually becomes a triad. Let me give you a couple of examples. I was watching some swans on a river one session, and the client commented on how they saw the parent swan gliding around the young swan, the cygnet, keeping a watchful eye out for danger, while the cygnet could focus entirely on doing whatever it was a cygnet should do on a river in April: feed, paddle, play. And the metaphor of this situation really spoke to the client, who then spent some time reflecting on their sadness that their own parents hadn't provided sufficient safety for them to truly be a child. So sometimes it's in a metaphorical sense that nature contributes. At other times, it's the actual animals or plants themselves which speak to the client. So towards the end of that session, another swan began to beat its wings loudly. Then it began to lift from the water, progressing really swiftly along the river channel as it powered up into the sky. And the client spoke of their awe at the power and strength of the swan, and how they could feel that power and strength within their chest as they watched. Another common experience of therapists working in nature is synchronicity. An example, again from Mary Jane Rust, she describes working with a grieving client who was struggling to deal with a bereavement. And they were sitting under a tree as the client said in despair, "There is no new life." And at that very moment, an acorn fell into her lap. So nature joins in. The space of nature seems to me often to be facilitative. Feelings of overwhelm and congested, chaotic, tangled feelings seem to be able to spread outwards into the space until there's enough room to breathe. When feelings are given space, they can feel more manageable. The space feels expansive, but it's often also feeling like it's connected to other places beyond our horizon. So perhaps we might stand by a river, knowing that the water that's passing us now will eventually flow into the sea. So nature reminds us there's more than we can see. Things are connected, things flow, change is continual. In my experience, clients bring different aspects of themselves to an outdoor session. A client who perhaps works in an office all day might find it hard not to simply arrive at the therapist office in much the same working mode. Being outside seems to change that. Sometimes the landscape seems to speak particularly to a certain place in a client. For example, I was working with a client near a coniferous forest, and she was reminded of a particular holiday in Eastern Europe, and then some important memories were brought into the session. Nature is a playground. As kids, most of us would have played outside, maybe in the countryside or on a beach. And being outside can help to bring out our childlike imaginative selves. Nature's also full of archetypes, perhaps most obviously illustrated in fairy tales. So think of dark, eerie forests, or magical trees, or mountains which might hold the source of all wisdom. Nature is powerful. At a time when I was struggling with some really big challenges in life, someone asked me, what was the most powerful thing I knew? And my answer was the sea. Whenever I feel daunted by a challenge, I remember the sea, and I find that power within me. For some people, the power of nature has a spiritual dimension. In fact, I suspect for most people, there's a degree of spirituality to their relationship with nature. But often in our society, we don't speak of that for fear of ridicule. Nature soothes, whether it's an expanse of green, the sound of running water, perhaps a view from a hill. So often there's a sense of soothing, simply being amidst the beauty of nature. Maybe that's why so many people find relaxation in listening to nature sounds. Moving in nature is embodied and sensory. I think it's possible to become quite frozen and stuck sitting in a chair in a therapy room. It's much harder when you're outside, moving across uneven ground and having to remain much more aware of your feet and your balance. And being outdoors can be a whole sensory experience, the sound of the birds, the smell of the plants, textures all around. And I find that that can help clients be aware of what's happening for them. Nature is essentially authentic. One view of the purpose of psychotherapy might be that we aim to help clients evolve as their true selves, finding that they can shed elements of what they have developed as a false self. So somehow standing amidst the unvarnished authenticity of nature seems to support this process. We respond to landscape. I'm going to show you a series of landscape images now, and just invite you to notice what responses you have as you feel your way into these landscapes. Or perhaps this landscape. Or how do you feel in this landscape? I wonder if you'd respond differently another day, and to what extent your responses are partly an expression of how you're feeling right now. Because our responses to our surroundings aren't static or constant or predictable. They're an expression of what's happening for us in that moment, that dialogue between our inner and outer worlds. And that's why those responses can be such a valuable part of the psychotherapy process, both illuminating and changing what's happening for the client. I think also places are the result of multiple layered processes, and we respond to those stories. When I look at this image of Glencoe, I respond to the dark, imposing hills and the majesty of the landscape. But I think my responses are also influenced by my awareness of the stories in the landscape, the strength of the glacier which carved out that valley, or the massacre of the clans that happened there years ago. So we respond to the stories held in the landscape. Nature is complex, untidy, difficult. It's not always beautiful. Sometimes it's dark or scary or troublesome. A client had been talking about a change in their life and how good it was feeling. Then, as we leant on a bridge, she became quiet and somber. We were gazing down at our dark shadows on the river, and she began to talk about her negative feelings about the change and her fear of what she might lose. And nature holds the dark and the light. For example, death and new life. And I think sometimes seeing this whole spectrum can be helpful. Of course, there are also problems in working outdoors. This is the obvious one, the weather. It can be relentlessly windy. It can rain endlessly. It can be cold. The sun can be unbearably hot. There have been times when I've had soaking wet feet and maybe another couple of client sessions to go before I can get home and dry out. Some wildlife is not so likable. If you're working outside, where do you put the tissue box? And it's not easy to manage note taking. So there are difficulties in working outside too. I want to turn now to look at some theoretical foundations. Branching out from more traditional psychotherapy methods, it felt important to me to have some solid foundations for this work and to think about how the theory could underpin the work I was doing. I'm going to start with Carl Jung. He had a retreat by a lake in Switzerland and spent a lot of time in nature and believed strongly that nature is necessary to us and we are impoverished without it. He believed that as society had become more urban, more industrialized, more civilized maybe, we have succeeded not only in conquering the wild nature all around us, but in subduing our own wildness. So he questioned the value of civilizing society and argued to reclaim our wildness. Theodore Roszak in the 90s was an American academic and social critic who argued that our connection to nature is a fundamental part of our psyches. Roszak was really the founder, or one of the founders, of ecopsychology, which is the focus on the relationship between us and the rest of nature. And he co-edited an important book in this field, Ecopsychology, Restoring the Earth and Healing the Mind. And that title really sums up the ecopsychology of the 90s and the way in which those two goals, restoring the earth and healing the mind, were seen as so interdependent. Roszak advocated reconnecting with our ecological unconscious, which he saw as the core of the mind where the earth can speak through us. He said, for ecopsychology, repression of the ecological unconscious is the deepest root of collusive madness in industrial society, and open access to the ecological unconscious is the path to sanity. So again, advocating that we reconnect with our ecological unconscious as a path to sanity. Joanne Macy, another ecologist and ecopsychologist from the 90s, looked at how our relationship to Earth is ancient. She asks, for our daily pursuits and frame of mind, what does it mean to be a living part of a living whole, like a cell in the body of Earth? Such a question, when we pursue it, brings us back to ancestral wisdom. Reconnecting with ancestral wisdom seems to me to be an important part of ecopsychotherapy. I think perhaps our ancestors knew far more than we do about the healing powers of a close relationship with nature. Moving on to David Abram in the 1990s, an American ecologist and philosopher who looked at how we dialogue with the life around us. He said our sensing bodies respond to the eloquence of certain buildings and boulders, to the articulate motions of dragonflies. It's the animate earth that speaks. Human speech is but a part of that vaster discourse. I think that links to what I've already said about nature joining in as co-therapist. The conversation between me and my client really is only one part of the discourse in the session. Jerome Bernstein, a Jungian analyst, argued that for some, that connection to nature is still vivid and powerful. And he described that as borderland consciousness. He said the highly developed and technologically dazzling Western ego was born at the expense of our psyche's cleavage from its roots in nature. And borderland consciousness for him was how, for some people, that violent cleavage from our roots in nature hadn't entirely severed the connection with nature. And so people with borderland consciousness seem to still have a far more intense or acute way of hearing or seeing animals or plants than perhaps most of us do. And you may know people who you think that description might fit. Nick Totten, psychotherapist and trainer, who in fact gave the TAP conference a couple of years ago, has done a lot of work on wildness is good. So his concept of wild mind is central to his work. And wild mind he describes as being embodied, spontaneous, inherently wise, animal, co-creative, and self-balancing. And importantly, he describes wild mind as the whole of our body, mind, self, not just the fraction isolated by consciousness. And this strikes me as radically different from Freud's idea that where id had been, there ego shall be. So where Freud talked about maybe suppressing the wild, taming the wild, Nick Totten is really advocating that wildness is good and wild mind is to be valued. And finally, Mary Jane Rust, I've already mentioned, but she is really the person writing most about ecopsychotherapy at the moment as a new form of psychotherapy, which includes our Earth story. Mary Jane Rust also talks about eco-anxiety and says that eco-anxiety is not a pathology, but rather a natural response to an extremely worrying situation. I think maybe increasingly we're all going to find ourselves talking with clients about their eco-anxiety. There are also mainstream psychotherapy theories that I think are useful within the field of ecopsychotherapy. And I'm going to mention just 3 of them. First, Winnicott. Winnicott explained that a child needs a parent to provide a holding environment of safety and nurture. As therapists, we might provide a holding environment for our clients. But we might also question, can we feel safe and nurtured by nature? Can nature be that holding environment? Of course, if nature is our holding environment, then realizing that our planet is under threat might cause huge psychological distress and destabilization. Klein introduced ideas of projection and introjection. So the infant might see the mother as a good breast, providing for all their needs. Or at other times, they might see the mother as a bad breast, denying them and deserving only of attack. And similarly, we might see the earth as a good breast, providing for us. Or we might see the earth as a bad breast, letting us down, and then we can exploit it. With maturity, the infant reaches an acceptance that the mother can be both good and bad. And then they have to accept the task of making reparations for those earlier attacks. What might our reparation to the earth look like? And finally, Kohut, who talked about self-objects as an aspect of another which an individual can use to develop their self-structure. And Kohut came up with 3 types of self-object: idealized objects, mirroring objects, and twinship objects. So the idealized object is the object which the child can aspire to emulate. The mirroring object reflects the child's worth, and the twinship object gives the child a sense of shared existence and companionship. It seems to me that nature can take each of those roles. So we might see the natural world as ideal, beautiful, awesome, powerful. If we know that we are part of that world, then that might mirror to us a sense of our own worth. And then the twinship of animals or plants, I think, is obvious to any pet owner or even a gardener. I'm going to go back then to those practicalities of the frame. It's not a contained space, but I do use a nature reserve with parking, which I think is vital. Sometimes we might walk some distance, and sometimes we don't walk very far at all. For me, the openness of the seemingly endless expanse of nature feels more valuable than the containment of 4 walls, which we've lost in moving outdoors. The consistency for me comes in meeting at the same place each week. Even if we go in a different direction, the starting point is the same for each session. What's interesting is that I think the changes in nature become very significant. So we notice how the light changes with the weather, or we notice signs of the seasons turning. And the constant movement and change can feel hopeful and fluid when a client feels stuck. Sometimes it's quiet, but sometimes the sounds become a valuable part of the session. Sometimes we move away from sounds, but always we notice our responses to sounds, and that becomes part of the process, illuminating what's happening for the client. Although I do choose quiet places, it's not confidential when there are other people around who might see us, including people who know us. So I might negotiate with a client before the session what we'll do in those situations. And usually what feels right is simply to say that we're in the middle of something and we can't stop to talk right now. When I'm walking alongside a client, I'm often not facing them, and I find that I use other senses more to attune to my client. So I perhaps sense their breathing, their movement patterns, listening to how they're speaking, rather than relying on their facial expression. But of course, there are times when we sit and we face each other, or just stop and turn towards each other. I do find holding a time boundary outside more difficult. A strategy I use is to have an alarm on vibrate set on my mobile phone for 10 minutes before the end of the session, and have my phone in my pocket so that I know when it's time to start moving us back towards the car. Although there are distractions outside, they become part of the session as we notice our responses to those distractions and become curious about that. So in a sense, the distractions become part of the session rather than a problem in themselves. I think it's important, if I'm going to invite the client to perhaps become slightly lost in their process, allow themselves to become engrossed in their process, then the responsibility falls on me to maintain an awareness of our safety. And doing a risk assessment before the session helps me to think through potential hazards. Not all of this can be managed by me. There's so much outside that is beyond my control. It's not possible to hold a predictable, consistent therapeutic frame outdoors in the same way that it is in a room. However, perhaps there's value in this. I'm going to use a quote from Nick Totten, who says, "It's equally crucial that the therapist dances outside the frame and that a trust can be established which is based on authenticity rather than predictability." Before heading outdoors then, a few last thoughts. You might like to consider that first diagram of psychotherapy and counselling predominantly happening indoors, but can move outdoors, or eco-psychotherapy predominantly happening outdoors, but the themes can be brought into indoor sessions. What's your response to that? Where do you feel you sit in that diagram? I have found it really valuable to read about this topic, to talk to people, and also to experience eco-psychotherapy myself as a client. And if other professionals would be interested in taster sessions, for example, that's certainly something that I would offer. So feel free to get in touch. I think it's important to think about the location. To visit the location that you're thinking of using with clients at different times, perhaps in different weather, and get a feel for whether it's going to work as a consistent place to meet with your client. You might like to check your insurance covers you for working outdoors. I use Balens and they were very happy for me to move outside with my clients. You might want to consider supervision. Your current supervisor might be happy to supervise this work, or you might feel you want to look for some extra supervision. In the resources section at the end, there are places where you might look for supervisors. And finally, you might like to revisit your contract and just check that there aren't things there that need adjusting or revising. I've included some resources here, some books that I have found particularly helpful, and some organisations, some websites where you might look for training and possible places to look for supervision. Usually at this stage, after a TAP talk, there would be a space for questions, but obviously with this format, that's just not possible. However, I have included my contact details in the resources section at the end of the slideshow. So if you have questions or would like to talk any more about this topic, I'd be delighted to hear from you. I think this is a really exciting and growing area of psychotherapy. And certainly I'm finding it very rewarding to be working in this way. I very much hope this has been of interest and some use to you. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.